Please subscribe. Hit the bell icon. Like, comment and share.
Open source software, an introduction. Before we begin, let us discuss what is meant by the term open source. The term open source refers to something people can modify and share because its design is publicly accessible. The term originated in the context of software development to designate a specific approach to creating computer programs. Today, however, open source designates a broader set of values, what we call the open source way. Open source projects or initiatives embrace and celebrate principles of open exchange, collaborative participation, rapid prototyping, transparency, and community-oriented development. So, what is open source software? Open source software is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. Now we come to the term source code. Source code is the part of software that most computer users don't ever see. It's the code computer programmers manipulate to control how a program or application behaves. Programmers who have access to source code can change a program by adding to it, changing it, or fixing parts of it that aren't working properly. Definition of open source software. Open source software is software that is distributed with its source code, making it available for use, modification, and distribution with its original rights. It typically includes a license that allows programmers to modify the software to best fit their needs and control how the software can be distributed. Doesn't open source just mean something is free of charge? No, this is a common misconception about open source. Open source software programmers can charge money for the open source software they create or to which they contribute. But in most cases, programmers find that charging users money for software services and support, rather than for the software itself, is more lucrative. This way, their software remains free of charge, and they make money helping others install, use, and troubleshoot it. Let's take a look at the history of open source software. The idea of making source code freely available originated in 1983 from an ideological movement informally founded by Richard Stallman, a programmer at MIT. Stallman believed that software should be accessible to programmers so they could modify it as they wished, with the goal of understanding it, learning about it, and improving it. Stallman began releasing free code under his own license called the GNU Public License. This new approach and ideology surrounding software creation took hold and eventually led to the formation of the Open Source Initiative in 1998. The Open Source Initiative. The Open Source Initiative was created to promote and protect open source software and communities. In short, the OSI acts as a central informational and governing repository of open source software. It provides rules and guidelines for how to use and interact with open source software, as well as providing code licensing information, support, definitions, and general community collaboration to help make the use and treatment of open source understandable and ethical. How does open source software work? Open source code is usually stored in a public repository, and anyone can access the repository to use the code independently or contribute improvements to the design and functionality of the project. Open source software usually comes with a distribution license. This license includes terms that define how developers can use, modify, and distribute the software. When source code is changed, the software must include a list of what was updated as well as the methods involved. Let us take a look at some examples of open source softwares. To name a few, we have VLC Media Player, jQuery, Linux, LibreOffice, Audacity, GIMP, Firefox, Python, and Apache Web Server. Is open source software bug-free? The short answer is no. No matter the type of software, open source or commercial code flaws will exist. With multiple parties making modifications and improvements, it's inevitable that open source software will contain quality, performance, and security flaws. However, the broad base of code contributors can also mean that bugs are identified and fixed faster. Now we will discuss the differences between open source and closed source software. The following table presents the differences. Open source software is available for a nominal fee or zero licensing and usage charges, whereas for closed source software, the cost varies based upon the scale of the software. Open source software is completely customizable, but it depends on the open source license. It requires in-house expertise. For closed source softwares, change requests must be made to the company selling the software. This includes bug fixes, features, and enhancements. Open source software is typically less user-friendly, but it can depend on the goals of the project and those maintaining it. Closed source software, in contrast, are typically more user-friendly. As a for-profit product, adoptability and user experience are often key considerations. For open source softwares, the community participating in development, review, critique, and enhancement of the software is the essence of open source. Closed source softwares do not have such communities. Enhancements or new features can be developed by the user if needed, whereas for closed source softwares, requests must be made to the software owner. Pros of open source software. Open source software is free. Open source is flexible. Developers can examine the codeworks and freely make changes. Open source is stable. The source code is publicly distributed, so users can depend on it for their long-term projects since they know that the code's creators cannot simply discontinue the project. Open source fosters ingenuity. Programmers can use pre-existing code to improve the software and even come up with their own innovations. Open source comes with a built-in community that continuously modifies and improves the source code. Open source provides great learning opportunities for new programmers. Cons of open source software. Open source can be harder to use and adopt due to difficulty setting it up and the lack of friendly user interfaces. Open source can pose compatibility issues. When attempting to program proprietary hardware with open source software, there is often a need for specialized drivers that are typically only available from the hardware manufacturer. Open source software can pose liability issues. Unlike commercial software, which is fully controlled by the vendor, open source rarely contains any warranty, liability, or infringement indemnity protection. This leaves the consumer of the open source software responsible for maintaining compliance with legal obligations. Open source can incur unexpected costs in training users, importing data, and setting up required hardware. Is open source software only important to computer programmers? No. Open source technology and open source thinking both benefit programmers and non-programmers. Because early inventors built much of the internet itself on open source technologies, like the Linux operating system and the Apache web server application. Anyone using the internet today benefits from open source software. Every time computer users view web pages, check email, chat with friends, stream music online, or play multiplayer video games, their computers, mobile phones, or gaming consoles connect to a global network of computers using open source software to route and transmit their data to the devices. Why do people prefer open source software? People prefer open source software to proprietary software for a number of reasons. Control. Many people prefer open source software because they have more control over that kind of software. They can examine the code to make sure it's not doing anything they don't want it to do, and they can change parts of it they don't like. Users who aren't programmers also benefit from open source software because they can use the software for any purpose they wish, not merely the way someone else thinks they should. Training. Other people like open source software because it helps them become better programmers. Because open source code is publicly accessible, students can easily study it as they learn to make better software. Students can also share their work with others, inviting comment and critique as they develop their skills. When people discover mistakes in program source code, they can share those mistakes with others to help them avoid making those same mistakes themselves. Security. Some people prefer open source software because they consider it more secure and stable than proprietary software. Because anyone can view and modify open source software, someone might spot and correct errors or omissions that a program's original authors might have missed. And because so many programmers can work on a piece of open source software without asking for permission from original authors, they can fix, update, and upgrade open source software more quickly than they can proprietary software. Stability. Many users prefer open source software to proprietary software for important, long-term projects. Because programmers publicly distribute the source code for open source software, users relying on that software for critical tasks can be sure their tools won't disappear or fall into disrepair if their original creators stop working on them. Additionally, open source software tends to both incorporate and operate according to open standards. Open source software often inspires a community of users and developers to form around it. That's not unique to open source. Many popular applications are the subject of meetups and user groups. But in the case of open source, the community isn't just a fan base that buys into an elite user group. It's the people who produce, test, use, promote, and ultimately affect the software they love.